All right. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to jump on here real quick, and I wanted to kind of go over something with wind speed. I thought it was interesting question brought up by somebody in the Facebook group, and I think they were kind of just joking around, but they were talking about how why it feels so much harder running into a headwind than running easier. Hard running. It feels hard running into a headwind, but it doesn't feel. It feels like you would get more out of a tailwind than you usually do. And like I said, I think they were kind of joking around a little bit, but I think there's something to it. And I posted this whole thing here on my response to it. But I think it is. I think it's important just to note this when you're training, especially if you train by yourself. I think it's important when you get into race day considerations, things like that. So if you look at this, if you're just running and there's no wind, which is probably not going to happen outside of a controlled situation, basically you run. So if you run 7-minute miles and there's no wind, that's what you run, right? Like there's no effect of wind. It doesn't increase your VO2 demand. So if we look at this VO2 demand, so that's just the amount of oxygen that's required to run that pace, right? So if you run into a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, that's going to cost almost 11% more in VO2. So let's use that 7-minute per mile example. So if you ran 7-minute miles under normal, pretty good conditions, it cost you, let's just say, 50 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight, right? So if you run that same pace into a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, it's now going to cost you 56 mLs per kg per minute, right? So it went from 50 to 56, and right. So if that's your easy pace, it's probably not going to be a huge difference, but it can make a difference, right? And so, if you're running into a headwind and you're able to draft off of somebody, going back to what we talked about a week or so ago about how much does drafting help you? Well, in a headwind, drafting is going to help you a lot, right? So if you can save the vast majority of that 11%, that's going to pay off big time over the course of 26 miles. And the faster you're running, the higher your absolute VO2 is going to be. 10% of 70 for a 5K, it now puts you at 7, so 77. That's going to put you at a very high level, which is going to take a big effect. It's going to put you in terms of fatigue and lactic acid and things like that, and running at a high percentage of your VO2. That can mean the difference between going out too hard and crashing, or being able to tuck in behind somebody and out kick them, right? So if you keep that in mind, and so even 10 mile an hour, like a lot of times you don't even really notice that. Like it's noticeable, but it's not severe. It's like when you get up to 15, 20 mile an hour winds, now you're talking some very, very big percentages that it's going to affect you, right? So, I think of a race like the Virginia Beach Marathon in March, the Yingling one, where you basically go up the side of the side of the ocean, turn around and come back, right? And so a lot of times half of the race is with the wind and half the race is against the wind, and depending on how the wind is, depends on whether or not, if you're going out, the wind is in your face or not, right? So races like that are going to be huge. And you think about a race like Boston, where a lot of times the race is in your face, the wind is in your face a lot of the times, right? So that's going to play a huge part, right? And so you have to recognize that it's going to cost you a lot more energy. And then you look at the flip side of that. So if you're getting a 10 mile an hour headwind, it's going to cost you almost 11% more energy, or 11% more oxygen to run that same pace. But a 10 mile an hour wind at your back is only giving you about 7%. So it is less. It's like, it's about 2/3 of what you would normally get. If you're what's costing you 11%, you're only saving 7%. You're only getting a 66% of the benefit, right? So you're not going to get as much help with a tailwind as you are going to get hindered by a headwind. So I think just keep that in mind. But it is nice. Like obviously, if we use that example again, and we run 7-minute pace and it's costing us 7% less oxygen to do that, that's an instant boost to our running economy by 7%, right? So that'd be like wearing twice the amount of running economy improvement that you'd get from a pair of Alpha Flies, right? So that's a very significant improvement. That's going to save you a lot of energy. So one, I mean, you're going to be able to run faster for longer periods of time, but it's not going to give you as much energy reduction as it would an energy cost running the same into a headwind. So I just wanted to point that out as you go in there. So somebody, I think Leah had asked about like trying to compare stuff, and that's all I'm saying. All this is showing is that like if you were running a certain pace and there was no wind, it would cost you a certain amount of oxygen. If you run into the wind, it's going to cost you more oxygen than what it's going to give you back if you were running with a tailwind. And that's all that we're saying, right? So now the thing is, kind of what she was saying is like, if you go out and you're on the same pace and do a 15-mile headwind, and you try to run that same pace and it costs you that much more energy, don't think that you're going to get on the way back all that time back. One, because you probably pushed too hard. So now you've thrown in other things like fatigue and things like that. So chances are you're probably not even going to get that negative 8%, 8.7% back, right? So if you lost 17% of the time, you're probably not going to get 9% of that back, right? You're only probably going to get a fraction of that because you're just going to be so fatigued from running into the wind that it's going to play. But now, the last thing I think I'll mention on that is that if you are in a situation where you're into a 10, 15-mile headwind, which is pretty common, note how that's going to affect your fuel intake, right? So if you're running the same pace and all of a sudden it's costing you a lot more oxygen to do that, what's the byproduct of that, right? So that the more intense we run, the more carbohydrate we're going to burn and utilize every single mile, right? So if you are in a situation like that and you're hell bent on running that pace, then your fuel needs are going to increase along with that, right? So just keep that in mind if you are in a situation like that. And so I think a lot of times in these early fall marathons, you can get stuck in a situation like that. Like, Chicago will have its places where it's windy. Indy could have its places where it's windy, things like that. Now, I don't think you'll get the whole race. You'll get some, since it basically goes like a 3-leaf clover in Chicago, you're going to get some points where you're with the wind, some points where you're against the wind. But just recognize that is going to take its toll on you if you can't tuck in behind a group of people or do something to minimize what the effect of that wind's going to have. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Don't overthink it. Just recognize that it's there and recognize that it's going to cost you more energy. So, and this is just a chart I found, but this is from Jack Daniels, and I recall seeing it in earlier editions of Daniels' Formula of Running, but I didn't see it in one of the later ones. And then the last thing I wanted to show you was just effective temperature. And the thing I want to highlight though here is that this formula does not account for humidity or wind. So I don't count up too much for wind. It's one of those variables where it's pretty tough to do. But humidity you can, because temperature and humidity, you can get dew point and wet bulb globe temperature and stuff like that, and you can get a pretty good combination of what it is. So this is just pace, or this is just heat, right? And so an example they use is a person running 5-minute miles. So at 50 degrees, if they're running a 5-minute pace for a marathon, that's beautiful. There's not going to have any effect on performance. That's where most of the fastest performances are. Real quick on the colder side of that, like if you get a day where I've run Chicago where it's very pleasant, but I've also run Chicago and it's been in the low 30s, right? So that's going to have a negative effect on performance as well. So if it's 30 degrees, and if you're used to being at like 60, 70, 80 degrees, and all of a sudden you get a 30-degree day, that 1.6% is probably going to be a little bit more. But you can see that, person going from, if they were ready to run 5-minute pace at 50 degrees, all of a sudden that's 5:05 pace. And that's just heat. For the cold, that's just going to be temperature anyway. And you could throw in wind on there for wind chill. But obviously the colder it gets, the more you're going to lose. So what we're more concerned is on the other side of that. And so I get pushback, and I'm still seeing a lot, even with my athletes, is that like they don't want to account for heat and humidity in their training. because of, for whatever reasons, like they don't believe me or what. I don't know what the answer is, or if it's in their own head, they don't trust themselves enough. But the thing is, if you're trying to run, say if you're trying to run 5 minute pace for something, and you're doing all your workouts at 80 degrees, that's a 9 second difference per mile, and that's just the heat. That's not even saying how much the humidity is going to affect in there. And I still see people who are just so trying to get right on that pace, right? And um, so there's one way to look at that. Like if you are in that range and you're completing the workouts and you're feeling strong, then that's got to be really confident that if you get into race day and you get a cool day, it is going to be there. Like you might not think that fitness is there, but it will be there, right? Like if you're doing 10-mile tempo runs between, and it's 80 degrees out and you're still averaging between 505 and 509 and your goal pace is 5 minute pace, I would be very, very confident that you're well on your way to be having the fitness on race day if you get a solid day. And the warmer it is, obviously, the more that's going to affect you. But just physiologically, and it's for a lot of the reasons here too, because the warmer it is, the more oxygen it costs to run a certain pace, right? And so we throw everything off of there when things are at their extremes and they don't line up appropriately. So just really keep that in mind, that you're not taking the easy way out if you're adjusting your paces. Now, at this point, it's late August, and ideally some of these temperatures are coming down now, and some of you're seeing like how much your fitness actually is there because you've gotten some really decent weather, and all of a sudden what was running like 10-15 seconds a mile slow is right where it should be. And so, but I see a lot of people still too that are getting into like the 9 and 10-mile tempos. And, like here yesterday, it was, 87 degrees, and it was a very warm day, especially now because we're getting some days where it is cooler. And then every like third day, it's super warm still. And so you get those cool days and you feel great. And then all of a sudden you get that hot day and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm nowhere where I thought I was, even though you still are. It just feels, you're still getting that shock because you had a couple days where it wasn't extreme weather, and you felt like your fitness truly was. So don't let that deter you, right? Like just recognize it is what it is and hope for the best that you get a decent day on race day. So like even if 50 is ideal, but it's anywhere between 40 and 60, you really don't need to adjust much at all, right? So you got a pretty big window of temperatures there if you're running an October and later marathon. September marathons might be a little trickier. But the later you get into October and into November, the much more stable I feel like those temperatures are. But even still, like if you've been used to training at 80, 90 degrees and you get a day that's 65 to 70, you're still going to be pretty darn close, and you're going to be really well adapted, right? And so this might come down even a little bit more. But during training and stuff, you've got to just recognize that it takes its toll, and you trying to force the issue on the paces isn't going to make it better. Usually, from what I observe year after year, is people will try to push on those paces, not adjust at all, and then wonder why the race falls apart, or they don't even make it to the starting line, and they're feeling super tired, way over fatigued, and they'll blame it all on the training plan, which the training plan is definitely hard, but they're making it harder on themselves because they're not being adaptive to what the weather is doing for them. So I just want you to keep that in mind. And this is, like I said, this is just straight temperature. So the other thing you can take away from that too is that how much humidity does play a role in effective temperatures too, because if it's 70 degrees and dry, there's really not much difference there. But if it's 70 degrees and 90% humidity, most of you can attest that small of a change in your pace is probably not realistic, right? It's going to be a much more significant change, right? Or you'll push through it, but it's going to completely change the scope of what the workout was intended to be. Instead of a marathon pace workout, it's more of a, probably like a lactate threshold workout or even faster. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because if you do push on that, like I'm having conversation with an athlete here in a little bit, and they're so worried about their fitness, but they're running everything way too fast for what the weather is, and they're really changing what the scope of the workout is, and then they're having troubles fueling, and it just adds to one another because they're running so fast they can't get the fueling that they need to support the workout, and then they're completely wiped out, and the next workout's affected, or we have to throw in an extra recovery day. So it just compounds onto each other, and that's what you don't want, right? You'd rather back it off and be able to move forward every single day, right? So just keep that in mind. I just want to share that with everybody since I posted a little bit about this on Facebook, but I think we can take a little bit more of a dive on here. So, all right, guys. So have a great rest of your day. I'm sure we will talk throughout the week, and I will talk to you later. All right, bye bye.